What if the oldest written words on earth weren't meant for us at all, but for gods who came before? What if buried in the cuneiform marks of Sumerian clay tablets lies a story more unsettling than any myth? A creation account that doesn't begin with humans, but ends with us, latecomers to a world already ancient when we arrived. In the British Museum, in dusty archives in Baghdad, in climate-controlled vaults across the world, fragments of baked clay carry stories pressed into wet mud more than 4,000 years ago. Stories of beings who descended from the heavens, of gods who shaped humanity with their own hands, of a time before time when the earth belonged to others and we were not yet here to witness it. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to histories that blur the line between myth and memory, between what we've been told and what ancient voices whispered across millennia. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient knowledge stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark, beneath the same stars the Sumerians watched with such intensity, recording movements that seem to matter more than their own survival. The tablets exist, the words are real, and what they describe, beings from the sky, humans created as servants, a world that existed long before our kind walked upon it, is written in the oldest language we can still read. Tonight, we'll trace those words back to their source, to the moment when humans first learned to write and immediately used that skill to record something that sounds less like legend and more like inherited memory of a world we weren't meant to remember. In 1849, a young British archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard was excavating the ruins of Nineveh in what was now northern Iraq when his workers uncovered something that would change our understanding of human history forever. Beneath collapsed palace walls, in rooms that had been sealed for more than 2,000 years, they found a library. Not a library of books, but of clay tablets, thousands upon thousands of them, their surfaces covered in wedge-shaped marks that no living person could read. Among these tablets were copies of stories far older than Nineveh itself, stories that had been carefully preserved, recopied, passed down through generations of scribes who understood they were maintaining knowledge that stretched back to the very beginning of written history. And when scholars finally deciphered those marks decades later, they discovered something unsettling. The Sumerians, the people who invented writing itself, had used their new technology not to record kings or trade or daily life, but to tell us exactly where humanity came from and who created us. Imagine the scene in those dusty excavation pits, workers pulling fragments from earth that hadn't been disturbed since the Assyrian Empire collapsed. Each tablet emerged crusted with centuries of accumulated dirt, the cuneiform marks barely visible until cleaned with soft brushes and water. Layard couldn't read them. No one alive could. This script had been dead for millennia, the language forgotten, the entire civilization reduced to biblical footnotes and classical legends. But he understood their importance, the weight of what his workers were finding. These weren't random pottery shards or architectural fragments. These were words preserved in baked clay, waiting. The tablets were shipped to the British Museum, where they sat in storage for years, too many to catalogue, too foreign to understand. It wasn't until the 1870s that George Smith, a banknote engraver turned self-taught Assyriologist, began the painstaking work of translation. And what he found, what he announced to a stunned audience at the Society of Biblical Archaeology in 1872, was a flood story that predated Noah, an ark built to preserve life, animals gathered in pairs, a righteous man warned by divine intervention, but older, stranger, more detailed, and attributed not to the Hebrew god, but to beings called Anunnaki, whose very name sent ripples through Victorian scholarship that still haven't entirely settled. Because here's what those first translations revealed. These weren't just stories. They were creation accounts written by the people who invented writing, who decided that the very first use of this revolutionary technology should be to record where they came from and who made them. Think about that choice. You've just developed the ability to preserve information across generations. What do you write down first? Trade records, laws, poetry? The Sumerians chose origin stories. They chose to tell the future exactly how humanity began, as if they knew this knowledge was too important to trust to oral tradition, too essential to risk losing to the corruptions of memory and time. The tablets kept coming, not just from Nineveh, but from Ur, from Uruk, from Nippur, from sites across Mesopotamia. Each excavation uncovered more fragments, more copies of the same stories, more pieces of a narrative puzzle that scholars have been trying to assemble for over a century and a half. And the more they translate, the stranger it becomes. Because these creation myths, if that's what they are, don't describe distant, unknowable gods working through mystery and magic. They describe beings with names, with genealogies, with specific roles and territories. Gods who argued with each other, who made mistakes, who created humans not from love, but from need. The word appears again and again in the earliest Sumerian texts, carved into clay with the kind of reverence usually reserved for the most sacred mysteries, Anunnaki. In every translation, it means roughly the same thing: those who from heaven to earth came. Modern scholarship translates it simply as the great gods, treating it as mythological language, the expected vocabulary of ancient religion. But here's what makes those tablets different from every other creation myth humanity has produced. The Sumerians wrote about the Anunnaki with a level of specific detail that reads less like worship and more like record-keeping. They gave them names, family relationships, specific cities they governed, particular technologies they brought. They described their arrival on Earth not as a metaphor, but as an event that happened at a specific point in history, in a specific place, for specific purposes. Anu, the sky god, father of the Anunnaki. Enlil, lord of the air, commander who made the crucial decisions. Enki, lord of the earth and waters, the scientist, the engineer, the one who would eventually create humans. Ninmah, the mother goddess, Enki's partner in creation. Ninhursag, the birth goddess. Inanna, queen of heaven. The list goes on, dozens of names, each with specific attributes, specific domains, specific personalities preserved in story after story. This wasn't vague polytheism. This was a bureaucracy, a hierarchy, a family tree that extended from heaven to earth with the kind of organizational clarity you'd expect from administrators, not mystics. And they came from somewhere. The tablets are explicit about this. An, the heaven, the place above, the realm before earth. The Sumerians didn't describe the Anunnaki as eternal beings who had always existed everywhere. They described them as arrivals, as colonizers, as a people who came from one place to another with specific goals in mind. The cuneiform sign for Anunnaki literally combines the symbols for heaven and earth, creating a word that means something like heaven-earth people, or more precisely, those who from heaven to earth came. Why would the oldest written language humanity possesses spend so much effort describing gods as travelers? Why the emphasis on their origin point, their journey, their arrival? Other mythologies describe gods who simply are Zeus atop Olympus, Odin in Asgard, Brahma in the cosmic realm. But the Anunnaki are always described in relation to their movement, their descent, their choice to be here rather than there, as if the Sumerians were recording not religious belief, but remembered history, as if they were writing down what their ancestors had witnessed and passed down through oral tradition until writing was invented and the story could finally be preserved in permanent form. The tablets speak of councils where the Anunnaki gathered to make decisions about Earth and humanity. They describe meetings, debates, disagreements about what to do with their creation. Enlil wanted to destroy humanity when we became too numerous. Enki argued for preservation. These weren't remote cosmic forces operating through ineffable divine will. These were personalities with agendas, conflicts, politics. The tablets read less like theology and more like dynastic history, the kind of record you'd keep about powerful families whose decisions shape the fate of nations. Consider this peculiarity. The Sumerian civilization appears in southern Mesopotamia around 3300 BCE, seemingly fully formed. No primitive precursors, no gradual development from simpler systems. Just sudden, sophisticated civilization. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, organized religion, complex agriculture, all emerging together as if someone had flipped a switch. And the very first things they wrote, once they had the capability, were accounts of gods who brought them this knowledge. Every other civilization develops writing slowly, starting with simple marks for counting goods, gradually building to more complex expression. But Sumerian cuneiform appears already capable of expressing abstract concepts, already able to record elaborate mythological narratives, already sophisticated enough to preserve the story of how they learned to write in the first place. Archaeologists call it the Uruk period, named for the great city that dominated southern Mesopotamia at this time. And Uruk itself is an anomaly. By 3200 BCE, it covered nearly 600 hectares and housed somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people. 600 hectares. To put that in perspective, that's larger than many medieval European cities at their height. This wasn't a village that gradually grew into a town that slowly became a city over centuries of development. This was urban civilization, appearing nearly overnight in archaeological terms, complete with monumental architecture, complex water management systems, administrative buildings, temples that required sophisticated engineering to construct. The Uruk period shows us cylinder seals for marking property, indicating complex concepts of ownership and bureaucracy. It shows us tokens for accounting, suggesting organized trade and taxation. It shows us pottery made with the wheel, metallurgy using copper and bronze, textiles woven on looms. All of these technologies appearing together in the same narrow window of time, in the same geographic region, as if someone had introduced the complete package of civilization all at once, rather than letting it develop organically over millennia. And the Sumerians themselves claim this was exactly what happened. They said the Anunnaki brought these skills, that Enki taught them writing, agriculture, mathematics, that Inanna brought the arts, music, sexual practices, warfare, that the Me, those mysterious divine gifts that could be transferred from God to God or God to human, contained all the knowledge necessary for civilization. The tablets don't describe humans slowly figuring things out through trial and error across countless generations. They describe instruction, teaching, technology transfer from beings who already possessed this knowledge to humans who received it fully formed. Western scholars, trained in evolutionary models where everything develops gradually, have struggled with this narrative. They've created theories about the development of Mesopotamian civilization that involve slow progression from the Ubaid period through the Uruk period, identifying incremental changes that, when viewed from a distance, create the illusion of sudden appearance. And maybe they're right. Maybe we're looking at 1,000 years of development that only seems sudden because the archaeological record is incomplete, because most sites remain unexcavated, because the evidence of gradual change has been lost to time and river flooding and the acidic soils of southern Iraq that dissolve organic materials. Or maybe the Sumerians were telling the truth. Maybe civilization did appear suddenly because it was taught, introduced, seeded by beings who already possessed it. Maybe the reason the first uses of writing were to record creation myths is because those myths were actually memories, and the Sumerians understood that this knowledge, the knowledge of where they came from and who made them, was the most important thing to preserve once they had the means to preserve anything. Long before the biblical book of Genesis was written, there was another creation story, older and stranger and preserved in fragmentary tablets found at Nippur. Scholars call it the Eridu Genesis, and it tells a story that should sound familiar: a great flood, a righteous man warned by a god, an ark built to preserve life, but with crucial differences that change everything. In this version, humanity wasn't created out of love or divine inspiration. We were created to serve, to work, to maintain the world on behalf of beings who found physical labor beneath them. And before the flood that nearly destroyed us, the tablets say, there had been cities on earth for thousands of years, kings who ruled for impossibly long periods, a world so ancient that the flood was sent specifically to wipe it clean and start over. The tablets that preserve the Eridu Genesis are broken, fragmentary, infuriatingly incomplete. Large sections are missing. Crucial passages end mid-sentence. But what remains tells a story that predates the Hebrew Bible by more than 1,000 years and describes events that may be even older. The flood hero in this version is named Ziusudra, later called Tunapishtim in the Akkadian versions, later still transformed into Noah in Hebrew tradition. But in the original Sumerian telling, the purpose of the flood is explicit. Humanity had multiplied too greatly, had become too noisy, had disturbed the gods with the chaos of their existence. Imagine the scene the tablets describe. Cities spread across Mesopotamia, filled with humans who had been created to serve but who had reproduced beyond control. The noise of their lives, their industry, their voices, their endless activity, rising to the heavens where the Anunnaki dwelt. Enlil, the commander, calling a council and declaring that the solution was annihilation. Let the flood come. Let the waters rise and drown this failed experiment. Start over with a clean slate. But Enki, who had engineered humanity in the first place, couldn't bring himself to allow total destruction. The tablets describe him approaching Ziusudra's house, speaking not directly to the man but to the reed walls of his dwelling, as if the other Anunnaki had forbidden him from warning humans, but he'd found a loophole. Build a boat, the reed wall whispers. Make it watertight. Bring your family, bring the animals. The flood is coming, and only those on the boat will survive. The dimensions given for the ark in the Sumerian version are specific, practical, the kind of instructions you'd expect from an engineer rather than a myth maker. The structure is cubic, designed for stability rather than navigation. It's not meant to sail anywhere, just to float, to ride out the deluge, to provide a survival pod until the waters recede. And when they do recede, when Ziusudra opens the window and releases birds to find dry land, when he finally emerges onto solid ground, the Anunnaki who descend to meet him aren't angry at his survival. Some of them, Inanna and others, are grateful. They hadn't wanted humanity destroyed. They'd been overruled by Enlil's decision, but are relieved that Enki's intervention saved the species. What makes the Eridu Genesis so different from later flood narratives is its matter-of-fact tone. There's no grand theological meaning imposed on the event. The flood wasn't divine punishment for sin or wickedness. It was population control. The gods weren't testing humanity's righteousness. They were solving a noise problem. And the survival of Ziusudra wasn't miraculous divine selection. It was one Anunnaki scientist preserving his creation against the wishes of his superiors. The story reads less like scripture and more like a disaster report, a clinical description of events that happened for practical reasons and had practical solutions. But here's what the tablets also preserve. Before the flood, they say, there were cities. 5 cities specifically: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak. These weren't mythological locations. They were real places, archaeological sites that have been excavated, settlements that existed in southern Mesopotamia. And the tablets say these cities were ancient even before the flood, that they'd been established when kingship first descended from heaven, that they'd been ruled by kings whose reigns stretched across impossible spans of time. The Sumerian king list exists in multiple copies, all telling the same unsettling story. Before the flood, it says, kingship descended from heaven to earth, and 8 kings ruled for a total of 241,000 years. Read that again, 241,000 years. After the flood, kingship descended again, but the reigns grew shorter, still impossibly long by human standards, but gradually decreasing until they reached what we would recognize as normal human lifespans. Modern scholars dismiss these numbers as mythological exaggeration, the kind of deep time that ancient cultures used to express very long ago. But what if they weren't exaggerating? What if they were recording something real, but measuring time by a different standard, or describing rulers who weren't human, whose lifespans operated on a scale we literally cannot comprehend? The first king listed is Alulim, who ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. Let that number settle in your mind. 28,800 years. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. The tablets list it as a specific duration, recorded with the same precision used for measuring grain or counting livestock. The second king, Alalya, ruled for 36,000 years. The third, Enmenluana, for 43,200 years. These aren't round numbers chosen for poetic effect. They're oddly specific, as if someone was keeping actual records of actual durations that just happen to be incomprehensible by human standards. Mainstream scholarship offers several explanations for these impossible timescales. Perhaps the Sumerians were using a different unit of measurement, not years but months or seasons, and the translation is misleading. But even if you divide these numbers by 12, turning years into months, you still get kings ruling for thousands of years. Perhaps the numbers are symbolic, representing dynasties rather than individuals, compressed genealogies where single names stand for entire lineages. Perhaps they're simply mythological flourishes, the ancient equivalent of fairy tales that begin once upon a time and don't worry about chronological accuracy. But the king list doesn't read like mythology. It reads like a chronicle, a careful record maintained by scribes who took their responsibility seriously. After the flood, the reigns become shorter. Jushur rules for 1,200 years, Kulasina Bel for 900, gradually decreasing until we reach historical kings whose reigns can be verified through other sources and whose durations match normal human lifespans. The list transitions smoothly from the impossible to the plausible, as if it's recording an actual change that occurred over time, a shift from one kind of ruler to another kind, from beings who lived for millennia to beings who lived for decades. What if the pre-flood kings weren't human? What if they were Anunnaki themselves, or hybrid offspring of Anunnaki and early humans, beings whose biology operated on a different scale? The tablets describe these early rulers as those to whom kingship had descended from heaven, not metaphorically appointed by divine right, but literally descended, brought down from somewhere else, transferred from the realm of the gods to the realm of earth. And if these rulers were Anunnaki, if they were the beings who created humans in the first place, then their impossibly long lifespans aren't exaggeration. Their documentation. They're the Sumerians recording exactly what they observed or inherited in cultural memory, a time before the flood when those who ruled were not like us, when time moved differently for them, when what we call immortality was for them simply biology. The tablets press these numbers into clay with the same confidence used to record trade transactions and astronomical observations. 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years, and then the flood, and then shorter rains, and then the gradual decline until we reach numbers that make sense to human understanding. As if something changed with the flood, as if whatever allowed those early kings to live so long was lost or diluted or withdrawn, leaving humanity to continue with only the echoes of what came before. In the Sumerian poem Enki and Ninmah, we find the most detailed description of human creation in ancient literature, and it reads less like divine magic and more like experimentation. The goddess Ninmah and the god Enki, identified as the chief scientist among the Anunnaki, work through multiple attempts to create the perfect servant creature. The tablet describes failures, adjustments, improvements. It describes mixing the essence of gods with clay from the earth. It uses language that some scholars have noted bears an eerie resemblance to genetic engineering, taking what exists, modifying it, creating something new that combines characteristics of two different sources. And the purpose is stated explicitly, to create workers who can perform the labor that lesser Anunnaki were growing tired of doing. The tablet is remarkably specific about the process. Enki calls for clay from the Abzu, the deep place beneath the earth. Not just any clay, but clay from a specific location, as if the raw material mattered, as if what already existed in that clay was essential to the work. Then comes the mixture, the clay combined with what the tablets call the essence of a god. Different translations render this word differently. Some say blood, others say flesh. Still others translate it more abstractly as divine spirit or life force. But the original Sumerian suggests something physical, something biological, something that could be extracted from a god and mixed with earthly material to create something hybrid. The first attempts fail. The tablet describes creatures that cannot speak properly, cannot control their bodies, cannot perform the tasks they were designed for. Ninmah creates one that cannot hold its urine, another that is too weak to work, another whose mind wanders and cannot focus. These aren't abstract theological failures. They're practical problems, the kind of issues you'd encounter in any engineering project where you're trying to create something that doesn't yet exist. And Enki and Ninmah respond not with divine pronouncements, but with adjustments, modifications, trying again with different combinations until they get it right. When they finally succeed, when they create the template for humanity, the tablets describe it as a birth. Ninmah is called upon to open the womb, to bring forth the first humans from whatever process has been established. And then comes mass production. The successful template is replicated. 7 birth goddesses are assigned to create more, each one following the same procedure that Enki and Ninmah perfected. The tablets say these goddesses created 7 males and 7 females. The first generation, the foundation stock from which all future humans would descend. Think about the language here. Template. Replication. Birth goddesses working in parallel to produce multiple copies of a successful design. This isn't the god of Genesis breathing life into a single human formed from dust. This is a manufacturing process, systematic and repeatable, with quality control and production quotas. The tablets even describe the birth goddesses being given specific instructions, specific materials, specific procedures to follow, as if they were workers themselves, trained in a technique they didn't invent but were expected to execute properly. And what were these first humans like? The tablets call them Lulu, which translates roughly as primitive worker or mixed being. Not quite divine, not quite animal, something in between designed for a purpose. The Epic of Atrahasis describes them as capable of following instructions, strong enough for physical labor, but limited in knowledge and understanding. They were given enough intelligence to perform complex tasks, but not so much that they would question their role or resist their purpose. A species engineered to be useful without being dangerous. Some researchers have looked at this description and seen parallels to modern genetic engineering. The idea of taking existing material, whatever hominids already existed on Earth, and modifying it with foreign genetic information to create a hybrid species. The idea of multiple attempts and failures before achieving success. The idea of a template that can be replicated. The idea of producing both males and females to ensure the species can reproduce. Whether you interpret these parallels as evidence of ancient knowledge or simply the universal patterns of creative work, the tablets describe a process that sounds more like laboratory procedure than divine miracle. But it was the purpose, always the purpose that defined humanity's creation. The tablets are brutally clear about this. We were not made for fellowship with the gods, not created to explore our potential or achieve greatness. We were made to work. Here's where the Sumerian accounts become genuinely strange. According to the tablets, the Anunnaki came to Earth with a specific mission, to mine gold. Not for decoration, not for currency, but for a purpose the texts describe as essential to their survival. For thousands of years, according to the Epic of Atrahasis, lower-ranking Anunnaki performed this mining work themselves, digging deep into the earth in a place they called the Abzu, the underground realm. But eventually they rebelled, refusing to continue the brutal labor. The solution proposed by Enki was to create a primitive worker by combining Anunnaki essence with whatever primitive hominids already existed on Earth. That worker was us, and the tablets are explicit. We were not created to worship or to have fellowship with the gods, but to work in their place. The Epic of Atrahasis devotes significant space to describing the rebellion of the Igigi, the lower-ranking Anunnaki who performed the actual mining labor. For 40 years, some translations say 40,000 years, depending on how you interpret the Sumerian time measurements, they toiled in the earth, extracting gold, carrying it to the surface, processing it for whatever purpose the higher-ranking Anunnaki required. The tablets describe the hardship, the exhaustion, the grinding repetition of labor that wore down even these powerful beings. Finally, they'd had enough. The Igigi gathered their tools and their anger and marched to Enlil's dwelling, surrounding it in the night, refusing to work any longer. The tablets describe the confrontation with remarkable detail. Enlil, terrified by the rebellion, calls an emergency council. Anu, his father, descends from the heavens to address the crisis, and the Igigi present their case. The work is too hard, the burden too great. They cannot continue under these conditions. The council faces a dilemma. The mining cannot stop. The gold is essential for reasons the tablets hint at but never fully explain. But the workers refuse to continue. The solution comes from Enki. Always Enki, the problem solver, the engineer. Create a replacement worker, he proposes. Take what already exists on Earth. Primitive hominids, creatures that walk upright and use tools but lack higher reasoning, and modify them. Mix them with our essence. Make them capable enough to perform the work but controllable enough that they won't rebel as the Igigi have. The council agrees. The Igigi are released from their labor. Humanity is created to take their place. And the tablets describe this transition matter-of-factly, as if it were an obvious solution to a practical problem. The Anunnaki needed workers. Creating a new species was more efficient than forcing their own kind to continue labor that had become unsustainable. But why gold specifically? The tablets never fully explain this, never spell out why this particular metal was worth the effort of the interstellar travel, colonization, and the engineering of an entire species to extract it. Some passages hint that gold was needed to sustain the Anunnaki themselves, that it had properties essential to their survival or their technology. Other passages suggest it was sent back to the heavens, to An, to the place the Anunnaki came from, implying it served some purpose there rather than on Earth. Zecharia Sitchin, in his controversial interpretations, argued that the gold was used to create a protective shield in the atmosphere of the Anunnaki's home planet, that they needed it to survive environmental catastrophe. Mainstream scholars dismiss this as pure speculation, noting that the tablets say nothing about planetary atmospheres or shields. But the question remains, why gold? Why establish an entire mining operation across vast distances for this specific metal? What made it worth the cost? The tablets describe the extraction process as taking place in the Abzu, and this is where the story becomes even stranger. Every ancient culture has an underworld, a realm beneath the earth where gods or the dead reside. But the Sumerian Abzu is described differently. It's not a supernatural realm. It's a physical location with geography, resources, workers, and specific operations. Enki is said to have established his dwelling in the Abzu, managing the work happening there. The texts describe noise, toil, digging, and extraction. Modern scholars translate Abzu as deep water or primordial ocean, mapping it onto mythological cosmology. But some researchers have noted that the descriptions match mining operations more closely than they match otherworldly realms. If the Anunnaki were physical beings who came to Earth for resources, the Abzu wasn't hell or the underworld. It was their extraction site, their industrial operation, the reason they were here at all. The word Abzu combines the Sumerian symbols for deep and source, suggesting a place far below the surface where something valuable originates. Enki's titles include Lord of the Abzu, and the texts describe him as having dominion over everything that happens in this deep realm. His temple in Eridu was said to have foundations that reached down into the Abzu itself, connecting the surface world to the deep place below. Traditional scholarship interprets the Abzu as the cosmic freshwater ocean that the Sumerians believed existed beneath the earth, the source of wells and springs and the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In this interpretation, Enki as Lord of the Abzu is simply the god of fresh water, of irrigation, of the life-giving moisture that made agriculture possible in the desert. It's a clean mythological framework that fits with what we know about how ancient peoples understood their world. But read the descriptions more carefully, and the Abzu starts to sound less like a mythological ocean and more like a mining complex. The tablets speak of the Igigi labouring in the Abzu, of the noise and toil that characterised their work there. They describe tools, extraction, the transport of materials from deep places to the surface. They describe Enki managing operations, organising workers, solving technical problems. When the Igigi rebel, they rebel specifically against the conditions in the Abzu, against the hardship of working in the deep places, against the exhaustion of extraction labour. If you were trying to describe a mining operation to people who had never seen industrial extraction, who had no vocabulary for deep earth mining or resource processing, how would you do it? You might describe it as a realm beneath the earth, where workers toiled to extract valuable materials. You might describe managers who oversaw the operations, solutions to labour problems, the noise and hardship of the work. You might describe a lord who dwelt in that deep place, who controlled what came out of it, who possessed knowledge of what lay beneath the surface. Some researchers have pointed to specific locations in southern Africa where evidence of ancient mining operations has been discovered. Deep shaft mines that radiocarbon dating suggests could be thousands of years old, far older than any civilization we currently recognize. They've suggested these could be the actual sites of the Abzu, the places where the Anunnaki extracted gold before their worker rebellion forced them to create humanity. Mainstream archaeology disputes these claims, arguing the dating is questionable and the evidence inconclusive. But the questions linger, hanging in the air like dust in an excavation pit. The tablets also describe the Abzu as a place of knowledge, where Enki kept the Az, those mysterious divine powers or technologies or knowledge bases that could be transferred from god to god. In one story, Inanna gets Enki drunk and steals the mez from the Abzu, loading them onto her boat and escaping before he sobers up enough to realize what she's done. This story is usually interpreted as mythology about how civilization spread from one city to another, with Inanna representing Uruk acquiring cultural knowledge from Enki's city of Eridu. But if the mess were actual objects, actual technologies or information storage devices, then the Abzu served not just as a mining site, but as a research facility, a place where the Anunnaki's most advanced knowledge was kept and protected. What emerges from these descriptions is a picture of the Abzu as the Anunnaki's primary operational base on Earth, the place where resources were extracted, where knowledge was stored, where Enki conducted his experiments and solved the problems that arose from colonizing a planet and managing a workforce. Not a mythological underworld, but a functional industrial and scientific complex located somewhere deep beneath the surface. In 1976, a scholar named Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet, arguing that the Sumerian tablets should be read not as mythology, but as historical record that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, that they came to Earth to mine gold needed to repair their planet's atmosphere, that they genetically engineered Homo sapiens by combining their DNA with that of Homo erectus. Mainstream scholars rejected his translations and interpretations almost immediately. Sitchin wasn't a trained Sumerologist, they said. He mistranslated words, ignored context, saw what he wanted to see, and yet his books sold millions of copies and continue to sell today, because regardless of their academic legitimacy, they offered an explanation for something genuinely mysterious. Why do the oldest creation stories describe humanity as a created species, engineered by beings from the sky, for specific purposes? Sitchin's central argument was simple. Take the tablets literally. Don't interpret them as mythology. Don't assume ancient peoples were speaking in metaphor or creating religious narratives to explain what they didn't understand. Instead, read the tablets as historical accounts passed down from people who witnessed or had direct knowledge of what they were describing. When the tablets say the Anunnaki came from the heavens, they mean it literally. These were beings from another world. When they say humans were created by mixing divine essence with earthly clay, they mean genetic engineering, combining Anunnaki DNA with whatever hominid species existed on Earth. When they say this happened for the purpose of creating workers, they mean exactly that. We are a designed species, engineered for labour. The academic response was swift and harsh. Sitchin's translations were wrong, they said. He didn't read Sumerian properly. He confused words, misunderstood grammar, imposed meanings that weren't there. He identified a planet called Nibiru that doesn't appear in the tablets the way he claimed. He described orbital mechanics that don't work. He created an elaborate story of alien intervention that the actual Sumerian texts don't support when read by people who actually know the language. And yet, the critique didn't fully address why the tablets describe what they describe. Even in proper academic translation, even in the work of trained Sumerologists, the creation myths say humans were engineered by gods who came from the sky, that we were made to serve, that we are a hybrid of divine essence and earthly material. The mainstream interpretation just adds layers of metaphor and mythology to explain these claims away. Sitchin removed those layers and asked, what if they meant it? His books became bestsellers precisely because they offered answers to questions that academic scholarship seemed to avoid. Why does civilization appear suddenly? Why do the oldest texts describe humanity as created rather than evolved? Why do cultures around the world share similar stories of sky gods who taught civilization? Sitchin provided a framework: extraterrestrial intervention, genetic engineering, ancient astronauts, made sense of these patterns even if his specific evidence and translations were flawed. The controversy he sparked continues decades after his death in 2010. His supporters point to the patterns, the shared narratives across cultures, the apparent sophistication of ancient knowledge that seems to exceed what should be possible. His critics point to the translation errors, the selective use of evidence, the disregard for archaeological context. Neither side has fully won the argument because the underlying mystery remains. The tablets exist, they describe what they describe, and removing all the ancient astronaut theories still leaves us with texts that claim humanity was designed by beings from elsewhere. Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the 20th century's preeminent Sumerologists, spent decades translating Sumerian tablets and wrote extensively about their creation myths. His translations are considered authoritative, and they confirm that yes, the tablets describe gods creating humans from clay mixed with divine essence, and yes, the purpose was to serve as workers. But Kramer and his colleagues interpreted this as religious mythology, the kind of story ancient peoples created to explain their existence and their relationship to the divine. The Anunnaki in mainstream scholarship are simply gods, no different from Zeus or Odin or Vishnu. The creation story is a myth that reflects the social structure of Sumerian society, where humans served in temples and worked for the benefit of the gods' earthly estates. There's no need to invoke ancient astronauts when standard mythological interpretation suffices. Kramer's work is foundational to our understanding of Sumerian literature. His book, The Sumerians, Their History, Culture and Character, published in 1963, remains a standard reference. His translations of creation myths, flood narratives, and religious texts are cited in virtually every scholarly work on ancient Mesopotamia, and his interpretation is clear. These are myths, stories created by a pre-scientific culture to explain the world around them. The gods are divine beings in the religious sense. The creation of humans is theological narrative, not historical record. In this interpretation, the Anunnaki represent the forces of nature, the powers that ancient peoples didn't understand and therefore personified as gods. The creation of humans from clay reflects the Sumerian understanding that people come from the earth and return to it. The mixing with divine essence represents the religious belief that humans have both physical and spiritual components. The purpose of serving the gods mirrors the actual social structure where citizens worked temple lands, brought offerings, performed rituals, all described as serving the gods who owned the temples and the cities. Mainstream archaeology supports this interpretation. Temple complexes in Sumerian cities show clear evidence of agricultural production, workshops, storage facilities, all managed as if they were the estates of the gods who were believed to dwell in the temples. Citizens of the city were considered servants of the city's patron deity. Kings ruled as representatives of the gods. The entire social, political, and economic structure was organized around the concept of humans serving divine masters. So of course their creation myths reflected this reality. They created stories that explained and justified the world as they experienced it. Kramer and his colleagues also point out that every ancient culture created creation myths, and all of them reflect the culture's values, social structure, and understanding of the world. The Greeks had gods on Olympus because they lived in a mountainous region and imagined divine beings dwelling on the highest peaks. The Egyptians had gods associated with the Nile because the river was central to their existence. The Sumerians had gods who created humans as workers because work, particularly agricultural and building work, was central to their civilization. This is how mythology functions. It's not coded history or half-remembered reality. It's creative expression, religious belief, cultural storytelling. Moreover, the tablets themselves show clear signs of being mythological rather than historical. They describe impossible events, gods who don't age, humans who live for thousands of years before the flood, creatures born from eggs or springing from blood. They describe cosmology that doesn't match physical reality, a flat earth, a solid dome of heaven, the sun and moon as gods rather than celestial bodies. They mix the clearly mythological with the clearly historical in ways that make separation difficult. Even the cities and kings that actually existed are described doing things that couldn't have happened. Academic consensus treats ancient creation myths with respect but not literal belief. They're important as windows into how ancient peoples understood themselves and their world. They're valuable as literature, as cultural heritage, as religious expression. But they're not meant to be read as eyewitness accounts or historical documentation. The Sumerians created beautiful, complex, sophisticated myths that serve their culture's needs. That's sufficient explanation. Invoking ancient astronauts or genetic engineering or extraterrestrial intervention adds unnecessary complexity to what can be understood through standard mythological analysis. And yet the questions persist, whispered in museum halls where the tablets rest behind glass, carrying words pressed into clay when civilization was new and the memory of its origins was fresh. But here's what keeps the questions alive, what prevents the ancient astronaut theories from completely dying despite academic rejection. The Sumerian civilization appears suddenly, with no clear evolutionary path from simpler forms. In the 1,000 years before 3300 BCE, the archaeological record in southern Mesopotamia shows small villages, basic farming, simple pottery. Then, in what seems like an instant in archaeological time, we have cities, Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, with populations in the tens of thousands. We have monumental architecture that required advanced mathematics and engineering. We have a complete writing system capable of expressing complex ideas. We have sophisticated astronomy that tracked planetary movements with remarkable precision. We have administrative systems, legal codes, medical knowledge, metallurgy. It's the suddenness that troubles researchers, the lack of intermediate stages, the feeling that civilization didn't gradually develop but was somehow imported, introduced, taught. The archaeological timeline shows the problem clearly. During the Ubaid period from roughly 6500 to 4200 BCE, southern Mesopotamia was inhabited by farming communities living in small settlements. They built simple mud brick houses. They made pottery with distinctive painted designs. They buried their dead beneath their homes. They practiced irrigation agriculture along the rivers. Nothing about the Ubaid culture suggests they were on the verge of creating complex urban civilization. They were successful farmers, competent builders, skilled craftspeople, but they were not architects of cities or inventors of writing or astronomers tracking celestial cycles. Then comes the Uruk period, beginning around 4200 BCE and intensifying dramatically by 3300 BCE. And suddenly, truly suddenly by the standards of cultural evolution, everything changes. Uruk itself grows to 600 hectares, possibly housing 80,000 people. The White Temple is constructed, a massive limestone structure rising on an artificial platform, its construction requiring organization, mathematics, engineering knowledge, and labor coordination on a scale that shouldn't exist yet. Cylinder seals appear, used to mark ownership and authenticate documents, implying complex concepts of property, authority, and bureaucratic control. The potter's wheel is invented, bronze metallurgy develops, and cuneiform writing emerges, not in primitive form but already sophisticated enough to express abstract ideas and record complex narratives. Where are the intermediate stages? Where are the proto-cities with a few thousand inhabitants, the experimental writing systems with limited vocabulary, the simple temples that gradually evolved into monumental architecture? They should be there, layered in the archaeological record showing the slow development from simple to complex. But they are largely absent. It's as if Sumerian civilization downloaded into the region fully formed, already possessing capabilities that should have taken centuries or millennia to develop. Mainstream archaeology acknowledges this problem and offers explanations. Perhaps the intermediate stages existed but haven't been found yet. Southern Iraq is difficult to excavate, politically unstable for decades, its ancient sites often buried under meters of alluvial deposits from thousands of years of river flooding. Perhaps there were centers of development in regions we haven't explored, places where the gradual evolution occurred before spreading to the sites we have excavated. Perhaps environmental factors accelerated development in ways we don't fully understand, concentrating population and forcing rapid innovation. These explanations are plausible, they're probably correct, but they remain speculative, based on what should have happened rather than what we've actually found. And in that gap between expectation and evidence, the ancient astronaut theories find their foothold. Because the Sumerians themselves offered an explanation for their sudden advancement, the Anunnaki taught them. The Me were transferred from gods to humans. Civilization was a gift, not a gradual development. Consider the number system. The Sumerians used base 60 mathematics, sexagesimal counting, which requires abstract thinking and sophisticated mathematical concepts. We still use their system today for measuring time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Why base 60? It's mathematically elegant, allowing easy division into halves, thirds, quarters, fifths, sixths, tenths, twelfths, 15ths, 20ths, and 30ths. But it's not intuitive. Most cultures develop base 10 systems, counting on their fingers. Base 60 suggests someone sat down and deliberately designed a mathematical system for maximum utility. Who did that? When? Why? The Sumerians had it from their earliest periods, as if it was already part of their knowledge when they began writing numbers down. Or consider their astronomical knowledge, which brings us to structures that still stand after more than 4,000 years, speaking of precision that shouldn't exist. Walk through the ruins of Ur today, and you can still see the massive ziggurat that dominated the ancient city, rising in stepped levels toward the sky like a mountain made by human hands. But perhaps human hands had help. The precision of these structures, their astronomical alignments, their mathematical sophistication, they suggest knowledge that shouldn't exist yet. The Sumerians could calculate planetary orbits, predict celestial events, track the precession of the equinoxes. They knew the Earth was round. They had a number system based on 60 that we still use for time and angles today. Where did this knowledge come from? How did people who supposedly just invented writing somehow already possess astronomical information that wouldn't be rediscovered until thousands of years later? The Great Ziggurat of Ur, partially reconstructed in the 1980s but originally built around 2100 BCE, rises in 3 massive tiers. Its base measures 64 meters by 45 meters. Its walls are oriented to the cardinal directions with remarkable precision. Its construction required moving hundreds of thousands of mud bricks, each one made to standardized dimensions, each layer carefully planned to create stable ascending levels. The engineering knowledge required to build such a structure without modern surveying equipment, without steel reinforcements, without the mathematical tools we take for granted, it staggers the mind. But Ur's ziggurat is relatively recent. The earlier ziggurats, the ones built during the height of Sumerian civilization in the 3rd millennium BCE, are largely gone, eroded by time and river flooding, destroyed by later civilizations who quarried their bricks for new construction. We can only imagine what they looked like at their peak, when their facades were decorated with coloured tiles, when their temples at the summit housed the statues of gods and the treasures of the city. The tablets describe them as reaching toward heaven, as places where gods and humans could meet, as sacred mountains built in the flat river plains, and their astronomical alignments weren't accidental. Research has shown that major Sumerian structures were positioned to mark significant celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, the rising and setting of specific stars. The Sumerians tracked the movements of Venus with particular intensity, recording its cycles with precision that wouldn't be matched by Western astronomy until the modern era. They knew that Venus's movements followed an 8-year pattern, appearing as both morning star and evening star in predictable cycles. They could predict when it would disappear from the sky and when it would return. This requires generations of careful observation, mathematical analysis, pattern recognition, or it requires someone teaching you the patterns, telling you what to look for, providing the formulas for calculation. The temples themselves served as observatories. Priests spent nights on temple roofs and ziggurat summits, watching the stars, recording their positions, noting their movements relative to the horizon. The tablets preserve these observations, thousands of years of accumulated astronomical data, compiled into catalogues and predictive tables. The dedication required for this work, the institutional continuity needed to maintain records across generations, the mathematical sophistication to make sense of what was observed, it all suggests a culture deeply committed to understanding the heavens. But why? Why did the Sumerians care so much about the stars? Agricultural calendars don't require tracking Venus or calculating planetary orbits. Religious observation could be satisfied with simpler celestial markers. The intensity of Sumerian astronomy suggests something more than practical need or religious devotion. It suggests they were looking for something, watching for something, tracking patterns that mattered for reasons the tablets hint at but never fully explain. Among the thousands of tablets discovered in Mesopotamia, a significant portion deal with astronomy and celestial observation. The Malapin tablets, dating to around 1000 BCE, but containing knowledge much older, catalogue stars and constellations, describe planetary movements, provide mathematical formulas for predicting celestial events. But here's what's remarkable. These tablets show knowledge of planets invisible to the naked eye. They describe the outer planets, Uranus and Neptune, which weren't officially discovered by modern astronomy until 1781 and 1846 respectively. How could ancient Sumerians know about planets they couldn't see without telescopes? The mainstream explanation is that they didn't, that we're misinterpreting the tablets, that what looks like outer planets is actually something else. But the alternative explanation whispers from the clay. They knew because someone told them, someone who could see what humans couldn't. The Mul.Apin tablets are actually two tablets that together form a comprehensive astronomical compendium. They list constellations along the paths of the moon and planets. They provide rising times for stars throughout the year. They describe the relationship between stellar positions and calendar dates. They contain tables for calculating the length of daylight and darkness at different times of year. This is sophisticated observational astronomy, the kind of knowledge that should require centuries of accumulated data and mathematical refinement. But the controversy centers on specific references that some researchers claim describe planets beyond those visible to the naked eye. The tablets list celestial bodies and describe their movements, their colors, their positions relative to other stars. Traditional scholarship identifies these as the 5 visible planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, plus various bright stars and constellations. That's the conservative interpretation, and it's probably correct. However, some passages describe celestial objects that don't quite fit the visible planets. Objects with unusual colors or movement patterns. Objects in positions that don't match where the known planets should be. Are these errors? Corrupted copies of earlier tablets where the scribes made mistakes? Are they mythological embellishments, gods disguised as stars, religious narrative mixed with astronomical observation? Or are they descriptions of planets that shouldn't be known yet? The debate is complicated by the fact that ancient astronomy mixed observation with mythology in ways we find difficult to untangle. The planets weren't just celestial objects, they were gods. Jupiter was Marduk, Venus was Inanna, Their movements had religious significance. Their positions influenced omens and decisions. Separating the observational data from the theological interpretation requires careful analysis, and different scholars reach different conclusions when examining the same texts. What's undeniable is that Sumerian astronomical knowledge was remarkably advanced. They understood the ecliptic, the path the sun appears to follow through the stars over the course of a year. They divided it into 12 segments that became the zodiac, a system we still use today. They knew that the apparent position of the stars shifts slowly over centuries, a phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes caused by the wobble of Earth's axis. Discovering this requires comparing observations separated by generations, maintaining records across time periods longer than individual human lifespans, recognizing patterns that unfold too slowly to be obvious within a single lifetime. How did they achieve this? The standard explanation is institutional continuity, temple priesthoods maintaining astronomical records for centuries, passing knowledge from one generation to the next, building on accumulated observations until patterns emerged. It's plausible, it's probably correct. But it requires assuming the Sumerians possessed the dedication, organization, and mathematical sophistication to conduct a multi-generational scientific project at the very dawn of civilization. At the moment when they were supposedly just learning to write, they were also conducting sophisticated astronomical research that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years, unless they didn't discover it themselves, unless they were taught, unless the knowledge came from the Anunnaki, who according to the tablets possessed understanding of the heavens that they shared with selected humans for purposes we can only guess at. And the knowledge wasn't just astronomical. It extended into the very structure of power and authority in Sumerian society, into the question of who had the right to rule and why. Sumerian king lists and temple records obsessively track genealogy, and the pattern is always the same. Kings claim descent from the Anunnaki, not metaphorically, not spiritually, but biologically. They describe unions between gods and humans, hybrid offspring who ruled as intermediaries between the divine and the mortal. The tablets record specific marriages, specific children, specific bloodlines that were considered sacred because they carried the blood of the sky. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero is described as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, a mathematical precision in describing heritage that seems oddly specific for mythology. These bloodlines were tracked, preserved, considered essential to legitimate rule, as if the genetic contribution of the Anunnaki mattered, as if what they had passed down through reproduction wasn't just metaphorical blessing, but actual biological inheritance. The concept appears throughout Sumerian literature. Kings weren't just chosen by the gods or blessed by the gods, they were descended from the gods. Their divine ancestry was literal, traceable through genealogical records that the scribes maintained with the same care they used for property records or astronomical observations. When a new king took the throne, his legitimacy rested partly on his bloodline, on his ability to trace his ancestry back to divine origins. The Epic of Gilgamesh makes this explicit. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, is 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal. His mother was the goddess Ninsun. His father was Lugalbanda, a mortal king who was himself descended from divine lineage. The mathematical precision is striking. Not mostly god or almost divine, but exactly 2/3, as if someone calculated the genetic contribution across generations. One divine parent and one half-divine parent produces offspring that are mathematically 2/3 divine. This matters because it describes a breeding program, a deliberate effort to maintain genetic lines that preserved Anunnaki characteristics while producing rulers capable of functioning in the mortal world. The tablets describe goddess mothers giving birth to kings. They describe divine fathers choosing mortal women to bear their children. They describe careful tracking of which offspring carried more divine essence, which bloodlines were purer, which families had the strongest claim to rule based on their celestial ancestry. In mainstream interpretation, this is simply how ancient peoples explained political power. Kings claimed divine descent to legitimize their authority, to place themselves above ordinary citizens, to create hereditary dynasties based on supernatural privilege. Every ancient civilization did this in some form. Egyptian pharaohs were gods incarnate. Chinese emperors ruled by mandate of heaven. Japanese emperors descended from the sun goddess. The Sumerian version, where kings were literally part god through biological descent, is just their cultural variation on a universal theme of sacred kingship. But the Sumerian version has a specificity that other cultures lack. They didn't just claim divine favor or divine mandate. They claimed genetic inheritance. They tracked it mathematically. They preserved records of specific unions, specific offspring, specific percentages of divine essence passed through bloodlines. They treated it as biology, not theology. As if the Anunnaki had indeed bred with humans, producing hybrids who inherited some of their creator's capabilities, longer life, greater strength, enhanced intelligence, making them natural rulers over pure humans who lacked these advantages. The tablets describe these hybrid rulers as living longer than ordinary humans, but not as long as the Anunnaki themselves. They describe them as stronger and wiser than commoners, but still subject to age and death, in ways the gods were not. They occupied a middle space, divine enough to command respect and authority, human enough to understand and lead their people. And their bloodlines were preserved through careful marriage, through unions designed to maintain the divine contribution across generations, through what sounds disturbingly like selective breeding to preserve desirable genetic characteristics. What happens when you take these descriptions literally? What happens when you treat the genealogies as actual family trees rather than mythological constructs? You get a picture of a hybrid species. Humans with Anunnaki genetic contribution, their DNA carrying remnants of their creators, their biology slightly different from pure humans who descended entirely from the Lulu, the primitive workers created in Enki's workshop. You get bloodlines that mattered not for religious reasons but for genetic ones. Families whose right to rule rested on actual biological inheritance of capabilities that other humans lacked. Is this true? Or is it elaborate mythology that we're misreading through a modern lens of genetics and DNA? The tablets can't tell us, or won't, leaving us to trace the bloodlines through fragmentary records and wonder what exactly was being preserved, what exactly was considered so valuable that entire dynasties organized themselves around maintaining it. And then there's the flood. That catastrophe that appears in every culture's mythology, but finds its oldest written form in Sumerian tablets. Every culture has a flood story, but the Sumerian version predates them all, and unlike later adaptations, it provides a reason for the catastrophe. The gods wanted to reduce human population, which had grown too numerous and too noisy. The Epic of Atrahasis describes human civilization before the flood as vast and advanced, cities filled with people created to serve but who had multiplied beyond control. The noise of humanity disturbed the gods, particularly Enlil, who decided to solve the problem by wiping the slate clean. But Enki, who had engineered humans in the first place, warned one man, Ziusudra, in the Sumerian version, Utnapishtim in the Akkadian, Noah in the much later Hebrew adaptation. And here's what the archaeological record shows. There is evidence of catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE, layers of water-deposited clay separating older settlements from newer ones, suggesting a real deluge that may have inspired the myth or preserved memory of an actual cataclysm. The flood narrative appears in multiple Sumerian sources, each telling essentially the same story with slight variations. The Epic of Atrahasis provides the most detailed version, explaining not just what happened but why. Humanity, created to serve the Anunnaki, had been fruitful and multiplied. The original population of workers had grown into thriving civilizations spread across Mesopotamia. Cities had expanded. Agriculture had flourished. Human ingenuity had created prosperity and abundance. But from the Anunnaki's perspective, this was a problem. The tablets describe the noise of humanity rising to the heavens, disturbing the gods' peace. Modern translations usually render this as literal noise, the sounds of millions of humans going about their lives, building, farming, celebrating, arguing, creating the constant background roar of civilization. But some scholars suggest noise might be a metaphor for something else: disorder, chaos, the unpredictability of a created species that had exceeded its intended parameters and was becoming difficult to control. Enlil, described as increasingly agitated by the human problem, proposes solutions that the tablets detail with disturbing clarity. First, send disease to reduce their numbers. Enki, always the protector of his creation, teaches humans medicine and healing. Then send drought and famine. Enki shows them how to dig deeper wells, how to irrigate more efficiently, how to survive the shortage. Each time Enlil tries to reduce human population, Enki intervenes to preserve them. Finally, Enlil calls for total solution, a flood that will wipe humanity from the earth entirely. The Council of the Anunnaki agrees. Even Enki, outvoted, is forced to consent. But he cannot bring himself to let his creation die. So he warns Ziusudra, telling him to build a boat, to make it watertight, to bring his family and animals aboard, to prepare for waters that will cover the earth. The dimensions given for the boat vary between different versions of the story, but they're always specific, always practical. This isn't a mythological vessel. It's an engineering project described in terms of cubits and materials and construction techniques. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which incorporates the flood story when Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim, describes the boat as cube-shaped, built of timber coated with bitumen to make it waterproof, divided into compartments to separate different types of animals. When the flood comes, the tablets describe it with the kind of detail that suggests eyewitness testimony passed down through oral tradition. The rains fall, the rivers overflow, the dikes break, water covers the land. The gods themselves, the tablets say, are terrified by the destruction they've caused, retreating to the highest heaven like dogs, cowering from a storm. Inanna laments the destruction of her people. Even Enlil seems shaken by the totality of what he's done. The water recedes after 7 days and 7 nights. Ziusudra's boat comes to rest on a mountain. He releases birds to test for dry land. First a dove that returns, then a swallow that returns, finally a raven that doesn't come back, indicating it has found places to land. He emerges, offers sacrifice, and the gods, smelling the offering, gather around like flies, the tablets say, grateful for the worship that had been absent during the destruction. Enlil is furious when he discovers that humans survived, but the other Anunnaki, particularly Inanna and Enki, defend Ziusudra. Humanity has been reduced to manageable numbers. The lesson has been taught. There's no need for total extinction. Enlil relents, and as reward for Ziusudra's obedience, he grants him and his wife immortality, sending them to dwell in Dilmun, a distant paradise where they will live forever as the sole humans to escape death. Now here's where mythology meets archaeology. In the 1920s and 30s, archaeologists, including Leonard Woolley, excavated sites throughout southern Mesopotamia and found something remarkable. Layers of water-deposited clay several meters thick, separating older occupation levels from newer ones. At Ur, Woolley found a clay layer 3 meters thick with no artifacts in it, just pure alluvial clay that could only have been deposited by massive flooding. Below this layer were ruins of an older city. Above it, a newer city built on top of the flood debris. The flood layer dates to approximately 2900 BCE, right around the transition from the early dynastic period to the following era. It's not universal. Not every site in Mesopotamia shows flood deposits from the same period, suggesting it wasn't a global deluge but a regional catastrophe. Perhaps the flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates river system on an unprecedented scale. But for the people living in the affected regions, it would have seemed like the end of the world. Water covering everything they knew. Cities drowned, populations decimated, and then, when the waters receded, the survivors rebuilding on top of the ruins. Is this the flood the Sumerians remembered? Did a real catastrophe around 2900 BCE become the foundation for the flood myth, preserved in oral tradition for centuries before being written down? Or is the archaeological evidence of flooding just coincidence, unrelated to the mythological narrative? The questions swirl like the floodwaters themselves, mixing memory and mythology until we can't separate what actually happened from what was later embellished, what was observed from what was imagined, what was real disaster from what became theological explanation. In 1936, workers digging near Baghdad discovered a curious artifact, a clay jar containing a copper cylinder with an iron rod. When filled with acidic liquid, it generated an electric current. The Baghdad battery, as it came to be known, shouldn't exist. The conventional history of electricity begins thousands of years later, and yet here was evidence of electrochemical knowledge in ancient Mesopotamia. Mainstream archaeologists argue it wasn't actually a battery, that we're misinterpreting its purpose. But it's not alone. Ancient texts describe stones that glow, metals that resist corrosion, processes for purifying substances that seem to require knowledge of chemistry that shouldn't exist yet. Are these exaggerations mythological embellishments? Or are they descriptions of technologies taught by the Anunnaki, preserved in cultural memory even after the ability to reproduce them was lost? The Baghdad battery sits in a museum now, a small clay vessel about 15 centimeters tall, unassuming to anyone who doesn't understand its implications. When German archaeologist Wilhelm König first examined it, he noticed the copper cylinder inside showed signs of corrosion from acidic substances. The iron rod had been suspended in the center of the copper, separated by an insulating material. Fill the vessel with vinegar or citrus juice, and it produces roughly 1 volt of electricity. It's a simple galvanic cell, the same principle used in modern batteries, but existing in Mesopotamia 2,000 years before Alessandro Volta supposedly invented the battery in 1800. The academic response has been skeptical. Perhaps it wasn't used to generate electricity at all. Perhaps it was a storage vessel for scrolls, with the copper cylinder protecting documents from moisture. Perhaps it had some religious purpose we don't understand. Perhaps the electrical properties are coincidental, unintended, meaningless. These explanations strain credibility because the design is so specifically suited to generating current. The materials, the configuration, the insulation keeping the metals separated. Accident or ignorance doesn't produce such precise functional design. And if the Baghdad battery was real, if ancient Mesopotamians understood electrochemistry, what did they use it for? The voltage is too low for most practical applications. Some researchers have suggested electroplating, using the current to deposit thin layers of gold or silver onto copper objects, creating the appearance of solid precious metal. Ancient texts describe such processes, objects that gleamed like gold but weren't gold. Techniques for making metals appear different from what they truly were. Chemical processes that shouldn't be possible without understanding electrolysis. The tablets speak of other impossible knowledge. They describe materials that sound like modern inventions, metals that don't rust or corrode, alloys with properties that surpass their components, substances that emit light without fire. The text known as the Babylonian account of creation mentions the Anunnaki possessing weapons that flash like lightning, objects that illuminate the darkness, tools that cut through stone as if it were clay. These descriptions are usually dismissed as poetic exaggeration, the language of mythology where gods naturally possess wondrous powers and magical items. But what if they're describing technology? What if the Anunnaki had materials science, metallurgy, chemistry beyond what their human servants could fully comprehend or reproduce? What if they taught some of these technologies to humans, who preserved the knowledge in cultural memory even after the physical examples were lost, the techniques forgotten, the understanding of principles diluted into mythology? There are hints in archaeological finds. Metal objects recovered from ancient Mesopotamian sites sometimes show composition that puzzles metallurgists. Alloys that shouldn't exist with the smelting techniques available at the time. Bronze with trace elements that improve its properties in ways that seem too sophisticated to be accidental. Evidence of surface treatments, hardening processes, refinement techniques that exceed what we think ancient peoples could accomplish. Are these anomalies the result of advanced knowledge passed down from the Anunnaki? Or are they evidence that we consistently underestimate ancient peoples' ingenuity, their capacity for experimentation and discovery? The conservative explanation is always more likely. Humans figuring things out through trial and error, developing sophisticated techniques through generations of accumulated experience. But the question persists. How did they know what to try? How did they develop advanced metallurgy and chemistry without the theoretical framework that modern science uses to guide experimentation? The tablets themselves preserve what might be technical knowledge disguised as mythology. Instructions for creating specific substances, descriptions of processes that involve heating, mixing, purifying, combining materials in sequences that sound more like laboratory procedures than religious ritual. Modern chemists examining these texts have occasionally recognized what appear to be actual chemical processes, real techniques for producing specific compounds, hidden in language that speaks of gods and magic but describes operations that actually work. What was lost when the Anunnaki left? What technologies did they take with them or allow to fade when they were no longer present to maintain them? The archaeological record shows a curious pattern. Early Sumerian civilization possesses advanced capabilities that are later forgotten, knowledge that has to be rediscovered centuries or millennia later. As if civilization started with a technological package, and then, over time, lost pieces of it, regressed to simpler forms, had to slowly rebuild capabilities it once possessed, but could no longer replicate or understand. And threaded through all of this is a pattern of conflict among the gods themselves, a division that shaped humanity's fate. Not all the Anunnaki agreed on what to do with their human creations. The tablets describe conflicts among the gods, particularly between Enlil, who saw humans as tools to be controlled and, if necessary, destroyed, and Enki, who seemed to have developed something like affection, or at least responsibility toward his creation. Enki is the one who warns of the flood, who teaches humans skills they weren't supposed to have, who repeatedly intervenes to preserve human knowledge and freedom despite Enlil's attempts to limit both. This narrative of rebel gods helping humanity against the wishes of harsher deities appears across cultures, Prometheus bringing fire, Quetzalcoatl teaching civilization, Oannes emerging from the sea to educate. What if these aren't separate myths but different cultural memories of the same reality? That some of our creators wanted us to remain servants, while others wanted us to become something more? The conflict between Enlil and Enki runs through Sumerian mythology like a fault line, creating tension in every story where both gods appear. Enlil is the commander, the authority, the one who makes harsh decisions based on control and order. When humans multiply too greatly, Enlil sends disease. When they survive, he sends drought. When they persist, he calls for the flood. His approach to the human problem is elimination, reduction, keeping the created species within strict limits. Enki is different. The tablets portray him as clever, compassionate in his way, unwilling to see his creation destroyed. When Enlil sends disease, Enki teaches humans medicine. When drought comes, Enki shows them irrigation. When the flood is decreed, Enki finds a loophole in his oath of silence by speaking to a reed wall rather than directly to Zeusudra, warning humanity while technically obeying the letter of the council's command. This pattern repeats across numerous texts. Enki teaching humans agriculture when they were supposed to remain simple laborers. Enki revealing the secrets of writing when knowledge was meant to remain the god's privilege. Enki showing humans how to make beer, how to create music, how to understand mathematics. Each time he's giving humans capabilities they weren't designed to have, elevating them beyond their intended function as primitive workers. Why? The tablets suggest Enki sees humanity as more than tools. Perhaps because he created us, shaped us in his workshop, he feels responsibility for our well-being. Perhaps he sees potential in us that Enlil refuses to acknowledge. Perhaps he believes that a creation capable of learning and growing should be allowed to do so. That limiting human development is wrong, even if humans were initially designed with limitations in mind. The Greek myth of Prometheus mirrors this pattern almost exactly. Prometheus, whose name means forethought, steals fire from the gods and gives it to humanity. Zeus, the king of the gods, punishes him brutally for this transgression, chaining him to a rock where an eagle eats his liver daily, the organ regenerating each night so the torment can continue. Prometheus suffers because he helped humanity, because he gave them technology they weren't supposed to have, because he elevated them beyond their intended role. In Mesoamerica, the god Quetzalcoatl is credited with teaching humans writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture. He's described as opposing human sacrifice, wanting to elevate humanity through knowledge rather than demanding their subservience. Other gods eventually drive him away, send him into exile. because his approach to humans threatens the established order where gods rule and humans serve. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BCE but drawing on much older Mesopotamian traditions, describes a being called Oannes who emerged from the sea and taught human civilization. Oannes is described as having the body of a fish but the head and feet of a man, a hybrid creature, neither fully one thing nor another. He teaches writing, agriculture, mathematics, astronomy. He civilizes humanity. And then he returns to the sea, leaving humans to continue what he started. Are these separate stories? Or are they different cultural memories of the same pattern? Rebel gods or advanced beings who helped humanity develop beyond our intended limitations, who taught us knowledge our creators didn't want us to have, who elevated us from servants to something approaching equals. The pattern appears too consistently across too many disconnected cultures to be pure coincidence. Either it's a universal archetype, something in human psychology that naturally creates stories of helpful, supernatural beings, or it's cultural memory of something that actually happened, preserved in mythology, because mythology was the only way ancient peoples could express or preserve what they'd experienced. If Enki was real, if he actually taught humanity forbidden knowledge, then we owe our civilization not to the gods who created us, but to the God who rebelled against his own kind on our behalf. We exist as more than primitive workers because Enki chose to give us the tools to become something greater, but the tools themselves remain mysterious, described in texts with language that blurs the line between the metaphorical and the literal. Sumerian tablets speak of the me, usually translated as divine powers or cultural attributes, but ascribed in ways that sound oddly mechanical. The me are objects that can be stolen, transferred, activated, contained in physical form. When Inanna steals the me from Enki, she loads them onto a boat. They're physical things with weight and presence. The tablets list more than 100 me, including kingship, warfare, writing, music, sexual practices, religious rites, and something translated as the giving of decisions. They sound less like abstract concepts and more like programs, technologies, knowledge bases that could be transferred from one being to another, downloaded into civilization like software into hardware. What if the me weren't divine blessings, but actual devices or data storage that contain the knowledge and capabilities the Anunnaki wanted humans to have access to? The story of Inanna stealing the me from Enki is one of Sumerian literature's most entertaining narratives, full of trickery and drama and reversals. Inanna travels to Eridu, where Enki dwells in the Abzu. She's welcomed warmly. Enki, drinking beer and enjoying her company, becomes generous, too generous. In his drunken state, he begins giving her the me, one after another, transferring these precious items to the goddess of Uruk. The tablets list what he gives her: the crown of kingship, the throne of kingship, the scepter of kingship, the priestly office, the godship, truth, the descent into the underworld and the ascent from it, the art of lovemaking, the art of kissing, the art of slander, the giving of judgments, the making of decisions, on and on, more than 100 specific me, each one named, each one transferred from Enki to Inanna. When Enki sobers up, he's horrified. He's given away the me, and Inanna is already fleeing back to Uruk with them loaded on her boat. He sends demons to catch her, to retrieve what he's lost, but Inanna's servant Ninshubur protects the boat, fending off each attempt to reclaim the me. They reach Uruk safely, and Inanna distributes the me throughout her city, establishing Uruk's power and cultural sophistication. Standard interpretation treats this as mythology about how civilization spread from one city to another, with Eridu representing older cultural authority and Uruk representing newer, rising power. The Mi are abstract concepts, the attributes of civilization that could be acquired through cultural contact, trade, conquest. When Inanna steals the Mi, she's symbolically acquiring the knowledge and cultural capital that makes Uruk a great city. But the text doesn't describe the Mi as abstract. It describes them as physical objects that can be loaded onto a boat, carried from one place to another, possessed or stolen. They're discrete items, countable and transferable. When Enki gives them to Inanna, he's not blessing her with divine favour. He's physically handing her things. When she flees, she's transporting cargo. When she reaches Uruk, she distributes actual objects that then confer capabilities on the city. What if the Mi were data storage devices? Knowledge bases containing information about how to perform specific cultural functions, instructions for creating kingship, protocols for religious rituals, techniques for lovemaking and warfare and decision-making. In modern terms, they sound like software packages, each one containing the code necessary to perform a specific civilizational function, transferable between users who know how to access and activate them. The tablets say there were more than 100 Mi. They list them, categorize them, describe which gods possessed which Mi and how they were used. This isn't the language of vague divine blessings. This is inventory management, a catalogue of specific items with specific functions. The Mi for writing is different from the Mi for kingship, which is different from the Mi for warfare. Each one is discrete, identifiable, transferable. If the Anunnaki possessed advanced technology, they would need ways to transfer knowledge to humans who couldn't understand the underlying principles. You can't teach complex science to people who don't have the framework to comprehend it. But you can give them devices that perform functions without requiring them to understand how those functions work. You can provide tools that encode knowledge in accessible form, instructions they can follow, templates they can replicate, programs they can run, even if they don't understand the code. That's what the Mi sound like. Not abstract powers, but concrete tools, technologies that contain and convey the knowledge necessary for civilization. Writing encoded in a format humans could access. Mathematics contained in a system they could use. Kingship defined by protocols they could follow. Each Mi was a package of civilizational capability, and distributing them meant distributing the actual tools and knowledge needed to build complex society. When the Anunnaki left, when divine presence withdrew from active management of human affairs, the Mi remained. Physical artifacts containing knowledge that humans could use even if they didn't fully understand it. And as long as the Mi existed, civilization could continue, maintained by the tools the gods had left behind. But tools break, knowledge degrades, and without the Anunnaki present to maintain or replace the Mi, humanity began to lose what had been given. Which brings us to the question that haunts every ancient astronaut theory, every attempt to read the tablets as history rather than mythology. If any of this is real, if we were created by beings from elsewhere, if our earlier civilizations were seeded with knowledge from the Anunnaki, then why don't we remember more clearly? The tablets provide an answer. Because they left. Around 2000 BCE, the Sumerian texts stop describing active divine presence. The gods withdraw, leaving humanity to develop independently. Some tablets describe this as punishment for human disobedience, others as a natural progression, the parent stepping back from the child they've raised. But the effect is the same. Without the Anunnaki present, their technologies fade, their knowledge is diluted through generations, their true nature is transformed into mythology. What was once historical memory becomes religious belief, then legend, then fairy tale, and we're left with fragments of the truth pressed into clay, waiting to be understood by descendants who have forgotten where they came from. The transition happens gradually in the tablets, not as a single, dramatic departure, but as a slow withdrawal. The earlier Sumerian text from the 3rd millennium BCE described gods actively involved in human affairs. They walk among us, dwell in temples, speak directly to kings, make decisions that immediately affect human civilization. The Anunnaki are present, accessible, engaged in managing the world they colonized and the species they created. By the 2nd millennium BCE, the texts begin to change. The gods become more distant. They still exist, still receive worship, still theoretically govern human affairs. But they do so from increasingly remote locations. They communicate through dreams and omens rather than direct conversation. They intervene less frequently in human matters. Their presence becomes more abstract, more symbolic, more like the distant gods of later religions than the hands-on managers of early Sumerian texts. What happened around 2000 BCE? The Sumerian civilization itself was collapsing, conquered by Akkadian and then Babylonian powers. The political structure that had organized Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years was fragmenting. Cities that had been independent states were incorporated into larger empires. The old ways were changing, and perhaps in that chaos whatever connection had existed between humanity and the Anunnaki was severed or abandoned. The tablets hint at reasons for the withdrawal. Some texts suggest the gods grew tired of managing humanity, that we'd become too numerous and complex to control effectively. Other texts suggest we were meant to develop independently eventually, that the initial intervention was always intended to be temporary. Still other passages suggest conflict among the Anunnaki themselves, disagreements about whether to continue involvement with humanity or to abandon the experiment and leave us to our own devices. Whatever the reason, the effect was profound. Without the Anunnaki present, the knowledge they'd brought began to erode. Technologies that required their maintenance stopped working. Techniques that required their instruction were performed incorrectly and then forgotten. The me, if they were physical objects, were lost or destroyed or locked away in temples where no one understood how to use them anymore. What had been science became ritual. What had been technology became magic. What had been historical memory became mythology. This pattern of knowledge loss is visible in the archaeological record. Early Sumerian civilization demonstrates capabilities that later periods struggle to replicate. The precision of astronomical observations decreases. Metallurgical techniques are simplified. Architectural ambitions become more modest. It's as if civilization started at a high level, and then, without the source of that knowledge to maintain it, gradually regressed to what humans could sustain independently. The tablets themselves became objects of reverence rather than sources of information. By the 1st millennium BCE, cuneiform was already becoming a dead language, understood only by specialized scribes who copied ancient texts without necessarily comprehending their full meaning. The stories of the Anunnaki became religious myths, disconnected from any sense that they might be recording historical events. The creation accounts became theology, explaining humanity's relationship to the divine rather than documenting our actual origins. And as the knowledge faded, humanity forgot. We forgot that we might have been created rather than evolved. We forgot that civilization might have been taught rather than discovered. We forgot that the gods might have been physical beings rather than spiritual forces. Generation by generation, the memory dimmed until it survived only in mythology. Stories we told ourselves about where we came from, stories we no longer believed were literally true. But the tablets remained, buried in collapsed buildings, sealed in the dry earth of Mesopotamia, waiting. And perhaps that's why the Anunnaki left them. Perhaps they knew humans would forget. Perhaps they understood that without their presence, the truth would transform into myth. And perhaps they pressed their story into clay specifically, so that someday, when humanity developed the ability to excavate, translate, and understand, we would find these fragments and be forced to ask, what if this isn't mythology at all? The forgetting wasn't complete, though. Fragments persisted in oral tradition, in religious texts, in cultural memories that preserved pieces of the original story even as they lost its context. And beneath the deserts of Iraq, waiting in the darkness, lies evidence we haven't yet uncovered. Beneath the deserts of Iraq, ground-penetrating radar shows anomalies, massive geometric structures still buried, cities that haven't been excavated, chambers and tunnels extending deep underground in patterns that don't match natural formation. Political instability in the region has prevented comprehensive archaeological investigation for decades, meaning vast portions of ancient Mesopotamia remain unexamined. What's still buried there? What tablets remain sealed in collapsed buildings? What technologies rest in chambers no one has entered for 4,000 years? Every major discovery in Mesopotamian archaeology has come from a fraction of what exists. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Iraq Museum, their collections represent perhaps 1% of what's actually there. And if that 1% tells the story we've uncovered so far, what do the other 99% say? The math is sobering. Archaeologists estimate that less than 5% of ancient Mesopotamian sites have been excavated to any significant degree. Of those that have been excavated, most were only partially explored. Test trenches, surface surveys, limited digs focused on monumental architecture while leaving residential areas and industrial districts untouched. And of the artifacts recovered from those limited excavations, only a fraction have been fully studied, translated, published. Iraq's modern history has made comprehensive archaeology nearly impossible. Wars, political instability, looting, the deliberate destruction of cultural heritage by extremist groups all have prevented the kind of systematic investigation that sites in more stable regions receive. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging show what's there, revealing the outlines of buried cities, the geometry of structures still sealed beneath meters of accumulated soil. But seeing them and excavating them are different things entirely. What we know about Sumerian civilization comes primarily from a handful of major excavations conducted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries: Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash. These digs recovered thousands of tablets, established the basic chronology of Mesopotamian history, identified major gods and kings and historical events, but they barely scratch the surface of what exists. Consider Uruk, one of the most extensively excavated sites. Archaeologists have worked there on and off for over a century, and yet even after all that work, less than 10% of the ancient city has been uncovered. 90% remains buried, still holding whatever artifacts, tablets, and structures lie beneath. If the 10% we've explored contains the library of Ashurbanipal's remnants and the White Temple, and countless tablets describing Anunnaki creation myths, What does the other 90% contain? Or consider Eridu, identified by the Sumerians themselves as the first city ever built, the place where kingship descended from heaven, the city of Enki where the Abzu was accessed. Eridu has barely been excavated. A few test trenches in the 1940s and 50s, some limited exploration in the 1980s. Most of the ancient city remains exactly as the Sumerians left it, buried under wind-blown sand and the accumulated debris of 4,000 years. What's there? What would we find if we could excavate Enki's temple fully? If we could explore the structures the tablets describe as reaching down into the Abzu itself? The Iraqi government maintains a list of over 10,000 archaeological sites within its borders. Perhaps a few hundred have received any archaeological attention. The rest are just coordinates on a map tells rising from the desert, places where ancient cities lie waiting. Each one potentially contains tablets we've never read, artifacts we've never examined, evidence that could confirm or deny or complicate everything we think we know about Sumerian civilization and the Anunnaki they worshipped. And then there are the sites that don't appear on any official list, locations that ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging reveal, but that have never been visited by archaeologists. Geometric patterns underground that suggest buildings, regular shapes that don't match natural geology, anomalies that could be chambers, tunnels, storage facilities, structures we can detect but can't identify or access. Some of these anomalies are located in remote desert regions, far from modern population centers, in areas too dangerous or too expensive to investigate properly. Others lie beneath modern cities, inaccessible without demolishing contemporary buildings. Still others are in disputed territories, archaeological preservation impossible in zones of conflict. The frustration for researchers is palpable. They know what's there. They can see it in radar scans and satellite images. They have evidence of buried structures, sealed chambers, untouched archaeological deposits that could revolutionize our understanding of ancient Mesopotamia. But they can't reach them, can't excavate them, can't even conduct proper surveys of many sites. What's in those sealed chambers? If the Anunnaki left when their active presence ended around 2000 BCE, did they leave artifacts behind? Are there temples we haven't entered that still contain the me, whatever those might be? Are there libraries larger than what Ashurbanipal collected, containing older texts, more complete, versions of stories we only know in fragments? Are there technologies sealed away, preserved in the dry climate of Iraq, waiting for someone to discover how they worked? The Baghdad battery suggests such artifacts might exist. If one electrochemical device survived by accident, preserved because someone didn't recognize it as anything special and left it in a storage jar, how many others were deliberately preserved, hidden, protected? The tablets speak of sacred objects kept in temple sanctuaries, divine implements touched only by priests who knew the proper rituals. What if some of those objects were actually Anunnaki technology, and the rituals were operational procedures, and the temples were storage facilities for equipment humans weren't supposed to understand? Every few years, despite the difficulties, new tablets are discovered. Construction workers unearth them while digging foundations. Looters find them and sell them on the black market, where scholars eventually encounter and translate them. Museums review their storage archives and discover tablets acquired decades ago that no one has examined closely. And each new tablet potentially changes the story, adds details, preserves information that wasn't in the texts we already knew. In 2014, a British museum curator translated a tablet that had been in storage since the 1870s. It contained an alternative version of the flood narrative with details not found in any other source. In 2018, a team working on fragmentary text from Uruk pieced together a previously unknown myth about Enki's creation of the first humans. These discoveries happen regularly, quietly, adding to our understanding piece by piece. And if this is what we find by accident in storage rooms and construction sites and looters' markets, what would we find if we could conduct systematic excavation of all 10,000 archaeological sites in Iraq? What if we could explore the 90% of Uruk we haven't touched, the vast majority of Eridu that remains buried, these sites that exist only as anomalies on ground-penetrating radar? The tablets we have might be the introduction to a much longer text. The story we've pieced together from recovered fragments might be the opening chapter of an epic we haven't fully uncovered yet. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the Iraqi desert, sealed in clay jars in collapsed temples, pressed into tablets that no one has read for 4,000 years, the rest of the story waits. Modern genetics has revealed something startling. Human DNA contains sequences that don't clearly trace back through evolutionary pathways, genetic material that appears suddenly in the fossil record without intermediate forms. Some researchers point to what they call human chromosome 2, which appears to be the result of two separate chromosomes fusing together in a way that shouldn't happen naturally. Mainstream science explains these anomalies through standard evolutionary mechanisms, random mutations, genetic drift, natural selection operating in ways we're still discovering. But the anomalies exist, and they've led some researchers to ask uncomfortable questions. Does human DNA show evidence of artificial manipulation? Are we exactly what the Sumerian tablets say we are? A hybrid species, engineered by combining one form with another, designed rather than evolved. The human genome was fully sequenced in 2003, and what it revealed puzzled geneticists. We have fewer genes than expected, only about 20,000 to 25,000 protein-coding genes, roughly the same number as much simpler organisms. But it's not the number of genes that raises questions. It's their organization, their origins, their unexpected characteristics that don't fit neatly into evolutionary models. Human chromosome 2 is the most striking example. All great apes have 24 pairs of chromosomes, 48 total. Humans have 23 pairs, 46 total. Where did the missing pair go? Geneticists discovered that human chromosome 2 appears to be the result of two ancestral ape chromosomes fusing together end to end. The fusion point is visible in our DNA, marked by telomere sequences, the protective caps that normally exist only at chromosome ends, appearing in the middle of chromosome 2 where the fusion occurred. Mainstream evolutionary biology explains this as a random mutation that occurred in our hominid ancestors. Two chromosomes accidentally fused, and the individual carrying this fusion survived and reproduced, eventually passing this chromosomal arrangement to all modern humans. It's presented as a well-understood example of how chromosomal changes can occur naturally through evolutionary processes. But some researchers have noted that chromosomal fusions are usually detrimental. They often cause fertility problems, developmental issues, health complications. For such a dramatic change to not only occur but to become fixed in the entire human population suggests either extraordinary luck or deliberate engineering. If you wanted to create a new species by modifying an existing one, altering chromosome number would be one way to ensure genetic isolation. making it difficult or impossible for your new creation to breed with the original species. Then there's the question of so-called junk DNA, the vast stretches of our genome that don't code for proteins and whose function remained mysterious for decades. We now know that much of this non-coding DNA serves regulatory purposes, controlling when and how genes are expressed. But some sequences still defy explanation, their purpose unclear, their origin uncertain. Some appear to be remnants of ancient viral infections, genetic material inserted into our ancestors' DNA millions of years ago. Others have no clear evolutionary precedent, sequences that appear in humans but not in our closest primate relatives, genetic, material that seems to have arrived without the intermediate forms you'd expect from gradual evolutionary change. The FOXP2 gene, essential for language and speech, shows an unusually rapid rate of change in the human lineage. It's nearly identical across all mammals, suggesting it's highly conserved because it performs essential functions that can't be altered without harmful effects. But in humans, it underwent specific mutations that don't appear in any other species, changes that occurred remarkably recently in evolutionary terms, and that directly enabled our unique language capabilities. Random mutation and natural selection could explain this, or it could be evidence of targeted modification, specific genetic changes introduced to give one species capabilities others lack. The more we learn about human genetics, the more anomalies appear, sequences that seem optimized rather than evolved, gene combinations that work too well together, as if designed for compatibility, regulatory mechanisms that control complex developmental processes with a precision that seems engineered. Mainstream science explains all of this through natural processes. Evolution is capable of creating apparent design through selection pressures operating over millions of years. But the alternative explanation whispers in the genetic code. What if we were designed? What if the Sumerian creation myths are describing genetic engineering in the only language available to ancient peoples? The tablets say Enki mixed the essence of the Anunnaki with the clay of earth, with whatever already existed here. In modern terms, that sounds like combining genetic material from two sources to create a hybrid. The tablets describe multiple attempts, failures, adjustments before success. That sounds like experimental genetics, trial and error until the desired result is achieved. The tablets say the result was a species designed to be intelligent enough for complex work, but limited enough to remain controllable. That sounds like selective engineering of specific traits. Are we reading too much into mythology, projecting modern scientific concepts onto ancient stories that mean something entirely different? Almost certainly. Human chromosome 2 has a perfectly good evolutionary explanation. The FOXP2 mutations can be understood through standard population genetics. The apparent anomalies in our DNA are probably just gaps in our understanding, mysteries that will be solved as genetic science advances. And yet the question persists, carved into clay 4,000 years ago and encoded in every cell of our bodies. Where did we come from, and why are we the way we are? The Sumerian account isn't unique. Across the world, separated by oceans and millennia, cultures tell strikingly similar stories. The Hopi speak of sky people who came to Earth in flying shields. The Dogon of Mali describe beings from Sirius who taught them astronomy. Hindu texts describe the devas and flying machines called vimanas. Egyptian hieroglyphs show gods with animal heads who came from the stars. Aztec legends speak of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who brought civilization and promised to return. Are these independent mythologies that coincidentally share the same themes? Or are they different cultural memories of the same events, humanity's earliest encounter with beings from elsewhere, preserved in whatever symbolic language each culture developed to express the experience? The Hopi people of the American Southwest preserve oral traditions about their origins that bear striking resemblance to Sumerian creation accounts. They speak of emerging into this world from a previous world below, guided by beings they call kachinas, spirit beings who taught them how to live, how to farm, how to organize their society. The Hopi describe these beings arriving in flying shields that move through the sky, technology far beyond what humans possessed. When the teaching was complete, the kachinas departed, leaving humans to continue what they'd started. Anthropologists interpret these as symbolic narratives about cultural migration, the Hopi people's movement from one region to another, mythologized as emergence from an underworld. The kachinas represent ancestral spirits, or personified natural forces, not literal beings. The flying shields are mythological embellishment, the kind of supernatural elements that characterize all indigenous cosmologies. But what if the Hopi were describing what their ancestors actually witnessed? Beings who came from elsewhere, taught civilization, and departed in flying craft. The pattern matches the Sumerian account. Advanced beings arriving, instructing humans, establishing society, then leaving. The Dogon people of Mali preserve astronomical knowledge that puzzled Western researchers when it was first documented in the 1930s. The Dogon described Sirius as a binary star system, Sirius A, the bright star visible to the naked eye, orbited by Sirius B, a dense white dwarf companion. They knew the orbital period, knew that Sirius B was small but incredibly heavy, knew details about the star system that weren't discovered by Western astronomy until the 19th and 20th centuries. How did an isolated West African tribe know about Sirius B, a star invisible without telescopes? The Dogon say they were taught by the Nomo, amphibious beings who came from the Sirius system in ancient times, emerged from the water, and instructed their ancestors in astronomy and civilization. Skeptics argue the Dogon learned about Sirius B from Western astronomers who visited the region in the early 20th century and incorporated this knowledge into their mythology retroactively. But Dogon oral traditions describing Sirius as a binary system were recorded before Western contact, suggesting their knowledge predates the proposed contamination. Hindu texts, the Vedas, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, describe the Devas, powerful, beings who descended from the heavens and involved themselves in human affairs. These texts describe Vimanas, flying palaces or chariots that moved through the sky and sometimes into space. The descriptions are detailed, technical, describing propulsion systems and navigation methods and weapons that sound like advanced technology rendered in poetic language. The Vaimanika Shastra, a text allegedly derived from ancient sources, provides specifications for building Vimanas, materials to use, construction techniques, operating procedures. Mainstream scholarship dates this text to the early 20th century, dismissing it as modern fabrication based on Western aviation concepts. But the ancient references to Vimanas in texts that are genuinely old suggest some basis for the legends, some cultural memory of technology that ancient peoples couldn't fully understand or replicate. Egyptian mythology describes the Neteru, beings translated as gods but described with physical characteristics, genealogies, conflicts, and interactions with humans. The hieroglyphs show them with animal heads on human bodies, often interpreted as symbolic representations of divine attributes. But what if the animal heads represent something else? Helmets, breathing apparatus, technology that Egyptian artists drew the only way they could, by making the beings look like combinations of familiar forms. The Egyptian creation myths describe a time before time when the gods ruled directly on earth, establishing civilization along the Nile, teaching humans agriculture, mathematics, writing, medicine. Then the gods withdrew, leaving divine pharaohs, hybrids of gods and humans, to rule in their place. The pattern repeats, beings from elsewhere establishing civilization, creating hybrid rulers, then departing. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl appears across multiple cultures. Aztec, Maya, Toltec, always described the same way. A bearded figure, unusual in populations that didn't typically grow beards. A teacher who brought writing, astronomy, agriculture, calendar systems. A civilizer who opposed human sacrifice, wanting instead to elevate humanity through knowledge. And a being who promised to return, sailing away on a raft of serpents but vowing to come back from the east. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, some indigenous peoples initially believed they might be Quetzalcoatl returning, because they came from the east with advanced technology and unfamiliar appearance. This tragic misidentification contributed to the conquest, but it suggests the depth of the cultural memory, the belief that the teacher who brought civilization would someday return. Are these separate myths arising independently from the universal human tendency to create stories about where we came from? Are they evidence of cultural diffusion, stories spreading from a single origin point and adapting to local contexts as they travelled? Or are they different cultural memories of the same events? Encounters with advanced beings who appeared across the world at humanity's dawn, teaching civilization wherever they went, remembered in whatever symbolic language each culture possessed. The similarities are striking. Beings from the sky or stars, teaching of civilization, hybrid offspring who ruled as intermediaries, eventual departure with promises or prophecies of return. These themes appear too consistently across too many disconnected cultures to dismiss as pure coincidence. Either there's something in human psychology that naturally generates these narratives, or there's something in human history, something real that happened, that all these cultures remember. Contemporary archaeologists and historians approach these questions with a mix of frustration and fascination. The frustration comes from seeing legitimate scholarship confused with ancient astronaut theories that cherry-pick evidence and ignore context. The fascination comes from genuinely mysterious aspects of ancient civilizations that mainstream science can't fully explain. How did the Sumerians develop sophisticated mathematics so quickly? Where did their astronomical knowledge come from? Why do their creation myths read like technical manuals compared to other cultures' poetry? Most scholars settle on this answer. We're underestimating ancient peoples' intelligence and capability, attributing their achievements to outside intervention because we can't imagine how they did it themselves. And perhaps that's true. Perhaps the Sumerians were simply more brilliant than we give them credit for, and everything that seems impossible was actually accomplished through human ingenuity we've forgotten how to appreciate. The academic response to ancient astronaut theories is rooted in a fundamental principle. Don't assume intervention when human capability suffices. Ancient peoples were just as intelligent as modern humans. Their brains were identical to ours. They had the same capacity for innovation, abstraction, mathematical reasoning, creative problem-solving. The only thing they lacked was accumulated knowledge, the scientific framework and technological base that we've built up over centuries. But lacking formal science doesn't mean lacking the ability to observe, experiment, and discover. The Sumerians developed sophisticated astronomy, through generations of careful observation. Priests spending lifetimes watching the stars, recording their positions, noting patterns, building predictive models based on accumulated data. No aliens required, just human dedication and intelligence applied consistently across generations. They developed advanced mathematics the same way. Trial and error, practical need, brilliant individuals making intuitive leaps that advance the field. The base 60 number system might seem arbitrary to us, but it's actually quite elegant, and a smart Sumerian mathematician could have developed it through experimentation with division and fractions. The sophistication we see isn't evidence of outside intervention, it's evidence that ancient peoples were smarter than we typically credit them for being. The same principle applies to their creation myths. We read them as describing genetic engineering because we live in an age of genetic engineering. But the Sumerians were describing creation using the concepts available to them: mixing, combining, forming from clay. These are pottery and metallurgy metaphors, the technological frameworks they actually possessed. We're projecting our modern understanding backward, seeing genetics and technology where they saw divine craftsmanship. Moreover, the ancient astronaut interpretation often relies on mistranslation or misinterpretation of texts. Zechariah Sitchin's work, which popularized many of these ideas, has been thoroughly critiqued by actual Sumerologists who point out his errors in reading cuneiform, his mistranslation of key terms, his selective quotation that ignores context. When you read the tablets correctly, in their full context, using proper linguistic analysis, they read as mythology, sophisticated, complex, meaningful mythology, but mythology nonetheless. The academic consensus is clear. Ancient civilizations accomplished what they accomplished through human intelligence, human effort, human ingenuity. To suggest otherwise is to diminish their achievements, to imply they weren't capable of greatness without outside help. It's a form of intellectual colonialism, projecting modern assumptions onto ancient peoples and deciding their accomplishments must have alien explanations because we can't imagine humans doing it themselves. And there's truth to this criticism. We do tend to underestimate ancient peoples. We do sometimes assume that sophisticated knowledge or technology must have exotic origins because it seems too advanced for the time period, and the ancient astronaut theories do often oversimplify, cherry-pick evidence, ignore contradictions, and see patterns that aren't really there. But the criticism doesn't entirely address the mysteries. How did the Sumerians know about planets they couldn't see? How did they develop astronomical knowledge that took us millennia to rediscover? Why does civilization appear so suddenly, so fully formed? The mainstream answers, patient observation, lost intermediate stages, incomplete archaeological record, are probably correct, but they remain somewhat speculative, based on what should have happened rather than what we've actually found, and the tablets themselves won't let us entirely dismiss the questions. Even in proper translation, even in full context, they describe creation through intervention. They describe beings from elsewhere teaching and shaping humanity. They describe us as a designed species made for a purpose. Maybe that's just how ancient peoples understood the world, through narratives of divine creation and intervention. Or maybe, as the ancient astronaut theorists argue, they were describing what actually happened in the only language available to them. The debate continues, will continue, probably forever, because the evidence allows multiple interpretations and we can't travel back in time to witness what actually occurred. But the questions themselves matter. The mysteries themselves are valuable. because they keep us asking, wondering, examining our assumptions about human history and human capability. In climate-controlled rooms across the world, tens of thousands of Sumerian tablets remain untranslated. There aren't enough scholars who can read cuneiform. There isn't enough funding for comprehensive translation projects. And so, they wait, these fragments of baked clay, holding stories and knowledge and possibly answers to questions we haven't learned how to ask yet. Every decade brings new translations, new insights, new pieces of the puzzle. In 2008, a tablet was finally translated that described the fall of an asteroid in ancient times with such precision that astronomers could calculate its trajectory and impact point. In 2011, another tablet revealed mathematical knowledge that wouldn't be discovered until the 16th century. What else is waiting in those archives? What other secrets are pressed into clay that no living person has read for 4,000 years? The tablet translated in 2008 is known as the planisphere, a circular star chart recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. For over a century after its discovery, scholars couldn't fully decipher it. The markings didn't match known constellation patterns. The annotations didn't make sense. It sat in storage, catalogued but not understood. Then researchers using computer analysis to decode the cuneiform realized what they were looking at. An astronomical observation of a massive impact event. The tablet describes the path of an object moving through the sky, provides angular measurements of its trajectory, notes the constellations it passed through. When astronomers input this data into orbital calculation software, they could reconstruct the event, an asteroid or comet fragment approximately 1 kilometer in diameter, entering Earth's atmosphere at a shallow angle, exploding in the air before impact. The trajectory calculation pointed to a specific location, the Alps, in modern-day Austria. And geological surveys of that region have found evidence of a massive impact event around 3200 BCE, exactly when the tablet would have been describing if the Sumerian astronomical records were accurate. An ancient Sumerian astronomer watched this impact, recorded its details with such precision that modern scientists could use those observations to calculate orbital mechanics and impact location thousands of years later. That's the level of observational astronomy the Sumerians possessed. Not vague mythological descriptions of celestial events, but precise mathematical records that remain scientifically valid today. The tablet translated in 2011 revealed advanced mathematical concepts. It described a method for calculating the area under a curve by dividing it into infinitesimally small segments and summing them, essentially the fundamental principle of integral calculus. This technique wouldn't be formally developed in Western mathematics until the 16th and 17th centuries, when Newton and Leibniz laid the foundations of calculus. Yet here it was, pressed into clay by a Babylonian scribe around 1800 BCE, used to calculate the position of Jupiter across the sky. The tablet shows that Mesopotamian astronomers understood not just how to observe planetary positions but how to predict them using sophisticated mathematical techniques that we thought were invented 3,000 years later. Every few years, another tablet reveals something unexpected. A medical text describing surgical procedures that wouldn't be practiced in Europe until the Renaissance. An architectural manual explaining load-bearing calculations that modern engineers recognize as fundamentally sound. A chemical formula for producing a specific substance that works exactly as described when replicated in modern laboratories. These aren't mythological texts. They're technical manuals, observational records, mathematical proofs. They demonstrate that Sumerian civilization possessed practical, applied knowledge that equals or exceeds what we expect from ancient cultures. And if this knowledge exists in the small fraction of tablets we've translated, what exists in the vast majority we haven't examined yet? There are museums and university archives around the world holding thousands of untranslated tablets in storage, not on display, not studied, just sitting in archival boxes, waiting for someone with the expertise and time to examine them. Every major museum with a Mesopotamian collection has a backlog, tablets acquired decades or even a century ago that have never been properly catalogued, let alone translated. The problem is expertise. There are perhaps only a few hundred scholars worldwide who can read cuneiform competently. Of those, only a fraction specialize in Sumerian. Most focus on the later Babylonian and Assyrian periods, when cuneiform was more standardized and easier to interpret. And all of these scholars have limited time, competing demands, their own research projects. There's no systematic effort to translate everything we've recovered. The work proceeds piecemeal, driven by individual interest and available funding. So the tablets wait. Some hold business records, grain receipts, administrative documents that tell us about daily life in ancient Mesopotamia, but don't revolutionize our understanding of civilization. Others might contain missing pieces of known texts, fragments that would complete stories we only know in partial form, and some, we have no way of knowing which ones until they're examined, might contain knowledge that challenges everything we think we understand about ancient capabilities and origins. What if there's a tablet that describes the Anunnaki not in mythological terms but in technical detail? What if there's a complete account of human creation that explains exactly what Enki did in his workshop? What if there are texts that spell out, clearly and unambiguously, whether the gods were metaphorical or literal, whether creation was theological narrative or historical record? We won't know until we translate them. And at the current pace of translation, it will take centuries to work through the backlog. Centuries during which answers might be sitting in museum storage, preserved perfectly in baked clay, waiting for someone to read them. Perhaps the truth exists somewhere between the extremes. Not ancient astronauts in the literal science fiction sense, not pure mythology in the dismissive academic sense, but something more nuanced and strange. Perhaps the Anunnaki were an earlier human civilization now lost to time, advanced enough to seem godlike to the Sumerians who came after. Perhaps they were a species that evolved on Earth before us and left traces we're only now learning to recognize. Perhaps they were exactly what the tablets say, beings from the sky who came for resources, created workers, taught knowledge, and eventually departed, leaving us to puzzle over the truth of our origins. What matters is that the tablets exist, the words are real, and humanity's oldest written statements about where we came from describe creation, intervention, engineering, and purpose. We may never know the full truth, but we can read what our ancestors chose to write down the moment they learned how to preserve information across time. And what they wrote wasn't, "We evolved slowly over millions of years." They wrote, "The gods came from heaven and made us." The mystery persists because the evidence allows multiple interpretations, each with its own logic, its own supporting data, its own gaps and uncertainties. The ancient astronaut interpretation sees the tablets as historical records of extraterrestrial contact. The mainstream interpretation sees them as mythology, reflecting social structures and religious beliefs. Alternative theories propose lost human civilizations, parallel evolution, interdimensional beings, or other explanations that try to account for the apparent sophistication of ancient knowledge without invoking aliens or dismissing it as mere mythology. We can't prove any of these interpretations definitively. We don't have the Anunnaki to interrogate. We don't have time machines to witness what actually happened. We don't have genetic analysis of the alleged hybrid offspring to test whether they actually carried non-human DNA. We have only the tablets, the archaeological record, the patterns in mythology, and our own ability to interpret evidence that remains stubbornly ambiguous. But here's what we know for certain. The Sumerians invented writing around 3300 BCE and immediately used it to record creation myths describing humanity as an engineered species made by beings from the sky. This is historical fact. The tablets exist. The translations, while debated in details, are broadly consistent across all serious scholars. The Sumerians said we were created by the Anunnaki who came from An, the heaven, who mixed their essence with earthly clay, who made us to work, who taught us civilization, who eventually left. They said this in the oldest written language we can read. They said it with specificity and detail. They said it as if they believed it was true, recording it for future generations with the same care they used for astronomical observations and mathematical calculations. Whether they were recording actual history, preserving cultural mythology, or something between those extremes, they chose this as the story worth preserving. And perhaps that choice itself matters more than whether the story is literally true. Perhaps what matters is that humanity's first written words were about where we came from and who made us. Perhaps what matters is that we've been asking these questions for as long as we've been able to write them down. Perhaps what matters is that the mystery persists, carved into clay, buried beneath the sands of Iraq, waiting in museum archives, pressed into fragments that still speak after 4,000 years. The Sumerians are gone, their cities are ruins, their language is dead except for scholars who study ancient texts. But their words remain, preserved in the most durable medium ancient technology could produce, baked clay that survives when paper crumbles, when stone erodes, when metal corrodes. They wanted to tell us something. They wanted future generations to know where we came from, and they succeeded. We're still reading their message, still trying to understand what they meant, still asking whether they were describing gods or aliens or lost civilizations or something we don't yet have words to name. The tablets say we were made, not evolved. They say we were designed for a purpose. They say beings from elsewhere shaped us, taught us, left us. Whether that's literal truth, metaphorical expression, or cultural memory of something we can't quite grasp, it's what they chose to write. It's humanity's oldest statement about human origins, and it suggests that the question of where we came from, whether we arose through natural processes or were created by intelligence, is as old as writing itself, maybe older, passed down in oral tradition until someone finally pressed it into clay so it would never be forgotten. We may never know the full truth. The Anunnaki, if they were real, are long gone. The evidence they might have left behind is buried in unexcavated sites or lost to time. The tablets that might answer our questions definitely remain untranslated in museum storage. We're left with fragments, hints, possibilities, mysteries that persist across millennia. But perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps mysteries are meant to persist, questions meant to remain unanswered, stories meant to be retold in every generation as we search for meaning in our origins. The Sumerians gave us the question. The tablets preserve it. And we, their distant descendants, still seek the answer, still wonder if the gods who made us were real, still ask whether we're exactly what they said we are, a created species, designed by intelligence from beyond, shaped for purposes we're only beginning to understand. The clay endures, the words remain. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the Iraqi desert, in museum archives around the world, in tablets we haven't yet translated, The rest of the story waits to be discovered by descendants who have forgotten where they came from, but who might, someday, remember. And so, as you drift towards sleep tonight, somewhere between dream and history, consider the ancient scribes pressing these words into wet clay by lamplight, knowing they would never see the future they were trying to reach. They shaped each cuneiform mark with care, wedge by wedge, preserving questions they couldn't answer, recording origins they might not fully have understood, but writing it all down because it mattered. Because where we came from mattered. Because the truth about the Anunnaki, whether gods or visitors or something stranger still, was worth preserving for descendants 4,000 years distant who might finally understand what they were truly saying. The tablets rest in museum cases now, behind protective glass, their cuneiform marks still holding mysteries we're only beginning to examine. Tens of thousands remain untranslated, waiting in storage, patient as the clay they're pressed into. Perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some knowledge is meant to wait, silent and still, until the moment we're ready to understand what our ancestors were truly trying to tell us about who made us and why we're here. Tonight, you're connected to those ancient scribes across an unbroken chain of time. The same questions that troubled them as they watched the stars from ziggurat summits trouble us now. The same wonder they felt recording creation myths in humanity's first written words moves through you as you consider where we came from and whether we arose naturally or were shaped by intelligence from beyond. 4,000 years dissolve into nothing. You're part of the same human story of watching, wondering, seeking meaning in the darkness. So let yourself drift now into the same darkness those ancient astronomers studied with such intensity, under the same stars they tracked so carefully, knowing something we've forgotten but might someday remember. The tablets will still be here when you wake, still speaking across millennia, still holding their secrets in baked clay. The Anunnaki, whether real or myth or something between, will still be waiting in the words, pressed into mud when writing was new and the memory of creation was fresh. Rest now. Let the ancient mysteries settle around you like desert sand covering ruins, gentle and inevitable. Let 4,000 years of questions become the rhythm of your breathing. Let the clay tablets speak their truth in dreams where gods and humans meet, where memory and mythology blend, where sleep finally comes to carry you into the same timeless dark that holds all our origins, all our questions, all the secrets we've buried and might someday unearth. Sleep well,